One thing that we hear from conservative politicians and from business leaders, particularly, and generally the establishment, is that the British economy has made a miraculous recovery out of this huge economic crisis that has affected the world, and we're doing pretty well, really. And yesterday I read a column in the Mirror, quite comically almost, that there's a definite feel-good factor which is encouraging people to spend again. Actually, things are looking pretty good. I was just wondering what you think of that, and because I think people have trouble making sense of it because they see things that contradict that, but they also see things that maybe confirm it.
Well, it's a bit of a counsel of despair if you're saying that things aren't as bad as if we're under a military dictatorship or something. That's not a very ringing endorsement for anything much. But on the issue of the recovery, the much vaunted recovery, I mean, this is George Osborne's big claim to authority as Chancellor now, because remember he had a disastrous, really, first few years. I mean, by 2012, the omni-shambles budget, nothing seemed to be working for him. But what you've had since early 2013 is a recovery of sorts, in the sense that GDP is going up. It's important to bear in mind that, as the ONS, his own chief economist, said, this is the slowest recovery on record. The impact early on of austerity, when Osborne first became Chancellor back in 2010, they really pushed at trying to make cuts happen. And you do the cuts, and what happens if you push through cuts at the pace they were driving them through between 2010 and really 2012, is you end up just sucking demand out of the economy. So strikingly, Osborne eases off on austerity for the last few years, running up to 2015. So they ease right off. They slow the pace of the cuts to virtually no cuts at all, no new cuts over the year up to the general election. And the second thing that happens, and this is the bit where the alarm bells really start to ring, is that they have this return, and there is a return to borrowing by consumers on a large scale, on a growing scale. A lot of it is coming through on unsecured borrowing, which can be credit cards, which can be if you buy a car and the car manufacturer gives you credit so you can buy the car, store cards, more worryingly things like payday lending, and very, very expensive borrowing. And lots of people are now turning to this. So unsecured lending is rising at the fastest rate since 2007 or thereabouts. If you look at the international situation, you can see there are all sorts of serious problems turning up there. So you're finding that because the rest of the world is looking so shaky now, you've seen the news from China over the summer, the stock market crash, but it goes for the rest of what they call the emerging market economies. It's a similar sort of story. So all of this adds up to a very, very shaky recovery. The problem with the British economy is that you have private sector debt, lots and lots. We are, depending on how you measure it, we're pretty much either the second or the first most heavily indebted developed or large developed country in the world, right? So there's huge amounts of debt out there that people over the 2000s in particular, the whole boom is driven by very, very easy access to very cheap borrowing on a large scale for an awful lot of households. So that's that part of the boom there. Then that crashes in 2008. There is too much debt, not enough money coming in to pay the debt. The economy grinds to a halt, you get a recession. The government wants you to fixate on the level of government debt, but the level of government debt isn't a problem. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, had a decent bit of research just a few months ago that said, look, if you're a country like Britain, when you've got, yes, government debt has gone up. It's gone up because you had the crash, and it was expensive to bail out the banks, and the recession was very deep, and government debt increased. But it's not increased so much that you should be this worried. If you make this your number one priority for everything you do, this damages the rest of the economy. So what George Osborne is doing is something that very few economists, I think, would now sign up to as a good idea. They would simply say it's daft to chase after the government debt.
So you're saying there's mainstream backing for an alternative path here?
This is where it's really bizarre. That if you come from any kind of background in economics, almost anybody who's a macroeconomist, it's a very, very large consensus, I think now, would say something like austerity basically is not a great idea. But certainly at the kind of pace that's being attempted by George Osborne initially, and that he says he's going to return to over the next few years, this is a bad idea. Government needs to be there to support the economy, not weakening by cutting its own spending. So that's the mainstream view.
So why is the government kind of hooked on this programme of austerity? I mean, surely they've got intelligent economic advisors, and they would argue that you're wrong, that this is absolutely necessary.
Well, I think the underlying drive here is, look, the mainstream of economics will tell you a story. It's the Keynesian story. It's one associated with John Maynard Keynes, writing in the 1930s in the Great Depression. How do we get economies out of the Great Depression? That's his big thing. And they tell you a story that basically says government spending can support a weak economy. If you're trying to recover from recession, you're trying to do so in a way that doesn't hurt people, government spending is a good idea. Mainstream economics would say that. In this country, the mainstream politics, the mainstream media says, oh my God, the deficit, the debt, that's the thing, we just have to do this, oh my God, that's the responsible thing, right? That's the story. And it's been like that really since the end of 2008. George Osborne, David Cameron have just hammered this message. The reason they're doing it, I think, is a reason that George Osborne let slip in a hearing at the House of Lords Select Committee on the Treasury just a few weeks ago, where he says, look, our problem is the debt that we have right now isn't the issue. The government debt we have right now isn't so much the issue. I'm paraphrasing. The problem we've got is, what if there's another financial crisis and we've already got all this debt and it's going to be really expensive to deal with another financial crisis. We'll have a recession, we'll have to bail out the banks, all of these things will happen. And we think, and I reckon they must think, another financial crisis is now quite likely. So we have to get rid of government debt now to create a space for when the banking system falls over again, right? That's the logic. Now, this is the insanity of the thing. That you decide you can't really do anything about the banks, about the financial system. So in order for that to carry on much as it always has done, it's massively large in this country. Relative to the size of the whole economy, this is the largest financial system on the planet, certainly for a developed economy like Britain's. So it's enormous, it's globally important. It's something that gives Britain a chance to throw its weight around the world. You want to look after this, and you don't want to reform it, because one of the things that you know about this big financial system is that what people really like about it is they can get away with murder. It's like, it's not very regulated. So you don't reform it, but that means it's very risky, it's very big, and if it crashes, it's very expensive. Yeah. So you get rid of government spending instead. That's the logic we're up against. It's fed through, I think, quite strikingly in the labour market, right? So people, if you go out and work, it's fed through very strikingly in what's happened to people's pay over the last few years. If you're in the public sector, the 1% pay cap, which amounts to, for most of the time, it's amounted to a cut, really, in how much you can possibly get paid over time. That's a real clampdown on your living standards. And what you've seen since 2008 is really the longest period of sustained decline in living standards, essentially since the Industrial Revolution. And this is the result of austerity. This is the result of pressure on wages in the public sector, feeding into pressure in wages in the private sector, weak labour market institutions, weak trade unions, few protections at work, this flexible labour market, the rise of zero-hour contracts, lots and lots of people pushed into part-time work when they wanted to be full-time. All of this adds up to a real squeeze on how much people are getting paid. And that is one of the direct impacts of austerity, I think, that people will feel. The other one is what's starting to creep in now, and what I think is going to get worse and worse over the next few years, is that we've seen some austerity already, and it's already damaged people. People have died as a result of this. That you've already had the restrictions on how much people get paid for housing benefit and this sort of thing. What the government is now lining up is even deeper cuts to a whole series of benefits that, if you put them all together, start to add up to a very serious attack on particularly the poorest standards of living, because they're the people who, because they're poor, they're most reliant on social spending, social security. So if you really clamp down on this, it's the poorest people who get hurt the most. Now, projections from the Institute of Fiscal Studies say that basically you're looking at people in the poorest 20%, so around about 3 million of them are going to be losing about £1,000 a year once the cuts kick in from next year onwards. That is a huge squeeze if you're already poor, to lose £1,000 a year. Rather than, as we've seen with revenue and customs, the tax collectors over the last 5 years, huge numbers, tens of thousands of job losses, if you actually employed more tax inspectors and said to them, go off and target companies and very wealthy individuals who are trying to avoid their tax and put a real effort into it, this pays for itself. I mean, this starts to get you money back in because you have the resources to go and chase sophisticated tax avoiders. So you could get a large amount of money out of that. I mean, revenue and customs themselves, their estimate is about £35 billion a year that they could reasonably go off and get. There are much higher estimates out. The difficulty, of course, is that if you just say tax avoidance, it can be quite hard to get these sums, because what you know about somebody who's avoiding their tax is they don't want to pay tax. And if you turn up to them and just say, we're going to make you pay their tax, they'll think of some other way to avoid the tax, right? So it can be hard to get that. There is a need to start thinking about new ways of taxing people. Financial transaction tax, very, very small. For each transaction that takes place in the financial market, very, very small tax applied to every single one. millions of these transactions takes place, you get a lot of money
Mm-hmm.
in from it. And there's an advantage claimed here. It would stop markets being quite so volatile and jumping up and down, and be a nice source of revenue for the government. So that's one option. The other one is, of course, looking more seriously at things like wealth taxes, and this is where you get into that issue of, well, the wealthy will just leave. Well, there's a bit of me. There's always a bit of me that thinks, look, well, so what? Right? What do these people do really? How bad is it for the British economy if someone like Lord Sugar says, if Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, I'm going to leave for China? It's like, well, what difference does that make, really? There are plenty of other talented people out there. This myth that only the people at the top of society can generate wealth,
Mm-hmm.
or can organise everything, or the people who really should be in charge, because, handily enough, they are the ones in charge. It's nonsense. There's lots and lots of people out there. The people who make the wealth are the people who do the work. It's the people who are there keeping the buses running, making the hospitals function, doing the teaching, working the factories. They're the people who make the wealth. It's not the people at the top who make the wealth. They're not the most important part of the whole thing. So to be honest with you, a few people, a few millionaires or billionaires are saying we're going to leave. It doesn't really matter that much. The important part is making sure that you've got wealth here, and that how this wealth is produced, how it's distributed, is something that we collectively start to decide, and we prioritise things that all of us collectively think are worthwhile, rather than assuming, as we now do, that if you just leave it to the wealthy to spend their wealth, they'll spend it wisely and productively. What we know about Britain and other large developed economies over the last few years is that there's more and more wealth ending up in the hands of the wealthy, but they are not spending it in productive investments. I don't think people will leave, is the other bit. Yeah. Look, if you look around the world, there is no correlation between low taxes and high rates of growth. That doesn't happen. If you look at somewhere like Sweden or other places where tax rates are somewhat higher than here, they don't have hordes of people just leaving. This isn't how things work. People stay here because they live here, and this is where they are based.
Mm-hmm.
For a small group of people who are highly mobile internationally, that might not be the place. But these are the people who want to live here but claim they're living in the Cayman Islands, that sort of thing. That's the bit you want to start to clamp down on anyway. And why should it be the case that somewhere like London is treated as a sort of happy hunting ground for tax avoiders and oligarchs the world over? Most businesses are here because there's a big market here. They can employ a well-educated workforce to work here, and they're not going to just up sticks and go somewhere else. That isn't how the world works. Same goes even for fairly mobile things like large banks. Now, there are all sorts of problems. That's discussed. We're having very, very large banks. But these aren't companies that can simply leave and go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. They're based in the City of London because it's got huge advantages for them. One of them is its relatively low rates of tax, but there's a whole load of other things as well. So in practice, I think this threat to up sticks and run away just doesn't really apply.
If you could recommend one policy, one economic alternative for policymakers to listen to as well, what would it be if you could set that out neatly?
Well, the obvious one is ending austerity, getting over the idea that the fiscal deficit that the government has is the most important thing out there. That seems like a simple, clear demand to raise. There is no reason to impose this. There's no logic for it for most people. There's a reason if you're at the top of society, it looks more reasonable to them. But for everybody else, this is a damaging, really deeply damaging economic policy, and one that should be opposed.